If you've ever studied the exception clause in Jesus' divorce and remarriage teaching, you've probably sensed something is kind of unusual about it. Jesus declares that remarriages are adultery. He makes that declaration 7 times in the Gospels. In 2 of those cases, Jesus includes an exception clause. For example, in Matthew 19:9, Jesus taught that if a man divorces his wife, except for fornication, and marries another, he commits adultery. And we see something similar in Matthew 5, verse 32. Now, the very first time I read these passages, I identified some traits of these texts that were just different than the surrounding text. So, for example, I wondered, why does Jesus seem to switch from a conversational type language to a if this, then this type of language? Why does Jesus use the word adultery to characterize the remarriage, but he uses fornication in the exception clause? Why does it seem like Jesus' audience understood him in Matthew 19:9, but today we have so many theories on what Jesus meant in the exception clause? So my view on the exception clause is that Jesus there is talking about an invalid marriage. The marriage is invalid because it imagines that a man married a divorced woman. The idea is that marriage is for life, therefore her divorce from her first husband didn't end that marriage. Therefore she's still married to her first husband even after the divorce. Hence her second marriage, which is imagined in the exception clause, is invalid because she's not available to be married because she's still married to her first husband. So that means the sex between the divorced woman and like her second husband is fornication because they're not actually married, and it's also adultery against the first husband. So it's 2 sins at once: adultery against her first husband and fornication with her second husband. So that means if her second husband divorces her, he is able to marry someone else since his marriage to her, his quote first wife, that was just a fake marriage, and so he was never actually married. So he's able to divorce his divorced wife. He's able to divorce her, and then go marry somebody else, and then that's okay. That's not adultery because he wouldn't be cheating on his first wife there. So I present 3 arguments in favor of this interpretation of the exception clause, and I'm going to explain the first 2, and then we're going to get into the third view, which is really the purpose of this episode. Before I do that, make sure you subscribe, like, comment, and get my book. It's called Divorce Your Remarriage. It's on Amazon.com. I have a link to it in the description below. Let's get going. All right, as I said, I'm going to present 3 different cases. The first one is the textual and contextual case for saying that the divorce and remarriage exception clause really means except for an adulterous remarriage. So let's take a look at that. In Matthew 5:32, it has 2 moral formulations. The first one is I have on red here on the screen. The second one is in blue. So here's how it reads. This is Jesus speaking on the Sermon on the Mount. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. That's the first moral formulation. And now we have the second moral formulation. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So now here, sexual immorality, that's in the exception clause. The Greek word for that is porneia, and it means fornication, right? So, and the word fornication there is referring to either all types of illicit sex or it's referring to one kind. And if it's referring to one kind, it would have to tell you that from the context. The reason why you need the context to tell you if it's one kind is because suppose Jesus was speaking about incest. That's one possibility. Or suppose Jesus here was just talking about like sex before marriage, for example. Well, if you're in the audience, how could you know which one of those he means? You would only know if he told you. So that's why if it's one kind, it's got to be in the context. Otherwise, there's no possibility his audience would know, and we are going forward with the presumption that Jesus is speaking so as to be understood. He wants his hearers to know what he has to say, and he would know, I'm going to have to give some context to them if I just mean one kind of particular sexual sin there. So it would be indicated by the context. Okay. So here's the question. How does the first moral formulation and the second moral formulation, how do they relate to each other? So there are 3 possibilities. The first one is the one I think. That is that the second moral formulation explains the exception clause. So when Jesus says whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, what Jesus is doing there is he's explaining what he meant by porneia. He's talking about a particular kind of sexual sin in the exception clause, and that kind is an adulterous remarriage, right? An adulterous remarriage would be an invalid marriage. They're not actually married. It's a fake marriage. And that's what Jesus is talking about in the exception clause. So that's what I think he's talking about there with the second moral formulation. There are a couple other options here. So one of the options is that The second moral formulation is referring to the remarriage. So the idea is Jesus is telling a story, and the story has two parts. The first part is the divorce, and then the woman remarries. It makes her commit adultery. That's her remarrying. And the second part is, well, when she goes and remarries, the guy who marries her commits adultery. But there's a problem with this interpretation, and that is that it's duplicative. If you look at the first moral formulation carefully there, it says that the man divorced her and then she went ahead and remarried. And when she remarried, the man who divorced her, he made her commit adultery. He is culpable for her adulterous remarriage. He can't just say, I divorced her. I'm not responsible for anything else she does. No, Jesus is saying, no, you are responsible. You have culpability because you could foresee she's likely to go ahead and marry somebody else. So you made her, you caused her, you're culpable for her adulterous remarriage. But of course, if she remarries, if he's culpable for her adulterous remarriage, her remarriage must be adultery, which means she commits adultery, which it says there clearly in the text. Well, if she commits adultery, certainly the man she marries also is committing adultery. It takes two, right? So you already knew that the man who married the divorced woman commits adultery, so you don't need the second moral formulation. If Jesus is telling one story with two parts, the second moral formulation is just unnecessary. So that would counsel against reading it as one story with two parts, because you already had both parts in the first moral formulation. Why is the second moral formulation there unless Jesus is using it to explain the exception clause, which is my view? The other way of reading this is to say, you know what, there just really is no relationship between moral formulation number one and moral formulation number two. These are just two independent true things. But the problem with that, though, of course, is it again is duplicative for the same reason as the previous one. So that doesn't seem likely. So here's the final meaning then of Matthew 5:32 from my perspective. Everyone who divorces his wife, except if she is a divorcee whose first husband is still alive, makes her commit adultery. So now let's look at Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. It has two moral formulations, if you look at that. And we're not going to read it, but if you look at it, remarriage is adultery regardless of which gender divorces. That's the lesson you get from Mark chapter 10. It says if you divorce and you remarry, it's adultery. If the wife divorces and remarries, it's adultery. It doesn't matter who's doing the divorcing and who's doing the remarrying. It's adultery if they divorce and remarry. That's what Mark chapter 10 says, and it says regardless of gender. Luke 16 also has two moral formulations, and the point there for the two moral formulations is that remarriage is adultery regardless of which gender was previously divorced. So again, Mark 10, Luke 16, very clearly they're saying, don't make this gendered. Don't give the man more rights than the woman. Now, why would they have to say that? Well, we're talking about roughly 30 AD in the land of Israel. This is a people who thought, because of the Mosaic law, that a man could divorce a woman, but a woman couldn't divorce a man. There's no women giving a man a certificate of divorce according to the Mosaic law. So they think it's gendered. The law is gendered. And Jesus is teaching, no, we're not doing the gendered thing anymore. So that's why they flip the genders in Mark 10 and Luke 16. Matthew has three moral formulations. You see it, two of them are in Matthew 5:32. One of them is in Matthew 19:9. So what we find about with regards to the gender is that remarriage is adultery regardless of which gender remarries, all right? And so you have the woman remarries in Matthew 5:32, the man remarries in Matthew 19:9. So there, Matthew flips the genders, just like Luke does, just like Mark does. But did you notice something? There's one thing missing, and that is there's one moral formulation that is an outlier. The second moral formulation in Matthew 5:32 is not needed to teach the genders are flipped. And Matthew's also the only one that has an exception clause. So this suggests that the additional moral formulation in Matthew 5:32 is there to explain the exception clause because it has no other purpose. So we have three suggestive observations. First, the second moral formulation in Matthew 5:32 is duplicative of the first one. Second, the second moral formulation in Matthew 5:32 is an outlier compared to Mark and Luke. It's unnecessary in order to flip the genders. You don't need the second moral formulation in Matthew 5:32 to accomplish that goal. And three, the second moral formulation in Matthew 5:32 works perfectly as an explanation for the exception clause. So the next step is to compare adulterous remarriage to adultery as an interpretation of the exception clause. So here's why we would do that. If porneia in the exception clause does not mean adulterous remarriage, there is no other text in that section of Matthew 19:9 or Matthew 5:32 to suggest one particular type of porneia. The only one kind of porneia suggested in that context there is an adulterous remarriage. So if Jesus meant one kind of sexual sin, the kind he meant was adulterous remarriage. If Jesus meant all kinds of sexual sin, then the only way to kind of logically interpret that would mean that Jesus is referring to adultery in the exception clause. And that is the most popular view, that the exception clause is referring to adultery, but I think that fails. And but the next step here is, once we identify kind of the two candidates, adulterous remarriage and adultery, the next thing is to kind of plug them in to the exception clause and take a look and see, does this make sense? Which one seems to make sense? And the adulterous remarriage, you have no problems. It works seamlessly. There's no issues. But if you put adultery in and you say that's what the exception clause refers to, you have an avalanche of problems. I'm going to show that to you here on this screen. Okay, so I got 5 problems here. I'm not going to go through all these for the sake of time, but you can pause and look at it. I also have another video where I discuss all of this, but you have an avalanche of problems if you try to put adultery in as the exception clause. And a lot of people, especially evangelicals, have never even heard that there are problems with putting the adultery in as the exception clause, but there is an avalanche of problems. It cannot be adultery. It must be something else, and the only other candidate is adulterous remarriage. So that's my first case. Here's my second case for why the exception clause refers to adulterous remarriage, and that is what Jesus is saying mirrors a document at the time, an extra-biblical document called the Damascus Document. So here's a quote from the Damascus Document. It says, "Shall be caught in fornication twice by taking a second wife while the first is alive." And it goes on from there. What is this document? Well, this is an extra-biblical document. It was found in Cairo, Egypt in 1897. It was found in the late 1940s by the Dead Sea, about 14 miles east of Jerusalem, there by the caves by the Qumran community that was likely the home of the Essenes. But here's the point. The Damascus Document, when you read this argument, it mirrors what it says in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9. And we know the Damascus Document was written before Jesus. So what Jesus is doing is he is affirming the view in the Damascus Document. So, for example, let's look at some of these bullet points. Both Jesus and the Damascus Document base their teaching for remarriage on Genesis. That's different than the Pharisees. The Pharisees did not base it on Genesis. The Pharisees based it on Deuteronomy. And you can see that very clearly in Matthew 19 and in Mark 10. So in Matthew 19 and Mark 10, the Pharisees are looking to the law, Deuteronomy. That's their focus. But that's not Jesus' focus. Jesus is looking at Genesis. You know who else is looking at Genesis? The Damascus Document. And so they were even quoting the same verse there in Genesis about how God created two. Okay, they both emphasize the number 2. You see that in Matthew chapter 19, and you also see it here in the Damascus Document. So the Damascus Document uses the word fornication to refer to remarriage. Hence, when Jesus uses the word fornication in the exception clause, he is also referring to remarriage. That's the case from the Damascus Document. All right, here's the main case we're trying to make here in this video, which is that porneia is a technical term meaning invalid marriage. Now, if the first case already works, then you don't need the third case. If the second case already works, you don't need the third case. But now this is case number 3. This is the third way of getting to this interpretation that the exception clause is referring to an adulterous remarriage. So what is a technical term exactly? So it's a word or a phrase that possesses a specialized meaning, and typically it's narrow to like a specific issue. So it has a purpose. These terms have a purpose. They summarize an idea and provides like a convenient kind of mental hook, and it facilitates kind of efficient communication. So, for example, in the New Testament, we'll talk about the gospel. Well, the gospel, if you look at the Greek, means good news. Well, it's not talking about all kinds of good news. It's talking about a particular kind of good news. Hence, it's a technical term. Or baptism. Well, the original word means, to wash with water or immerse, but they're not talking about taking a shower. They're talking about a specific church ordinance, baptism. Or the word flesh. Well, the word flesh, we think of like human flesh, right? Well, the word flesh, though, in the New Testament, in some uses, is talking about our sinful nature. And you know that from the context. And then the word world. The world can refer to like all of the people, or it can talk about the kind of the fallen nature that we have to deal with kind of in the world. So it's kind of like this larger concept. So anyway, so those are some examples in the New Testament, technical terms. We have them all in lots of different places in the New Testament. We don't even notice them. We just read them and we keep moving along because we already know what they are. So here's some examples in Christian theology of technical terms. So the word Trinity has a very specific meaning, or the word imputation. We know what we're talking about there, about the imputation of Christ's righteousness, and the idea of covenant. So these are some examples in Christian theology. So The premise here is that porneia in the exception clause is a technical term meaning invalid marriage. So just as gospel means good news, but we know specifically it's talking about one kind of good news, that is, Jesus came here to save us from our sins. So porneia in the exception clause can refer to lots of different things, but in the Jewish debate about divorce and remarriage, it has a specific meaning, which is invalid marriage. So what factors do we look at to figure out if a particular term should be viewed as technical? Well, I've got 6 factors here that you're supposed to look at, and I have them highlighted here. Blue means yes, I think porneia qualifies as a technical term under this factor. And then orange means, well, maybe I would lean yes. And I don't have any red on here or anything like that for stop, like no, it doesn't work, because all of them work or come close to working. So I only needed 2 colors here. So let's go through these 6 factors. Now, let me just say this. If you only have one factor, probably not enough. If you have 2 factors, probably not enough, depending on which factors they are. But we have, as you can see from your screen, a lot of factors in favor of viewing porneia as a technical term referring to an invalid marriage. So first, there's a pattern of use in one context. There definitely is a pattern of use here. We see it in Matthew 5:32. We see it in Matthew 19:9. Now, Jesus refers to remarriage as adultery 7 times. Paul talks about a woman who remarries to a second man in Romans chapter 7, and he calls her an adulteress. So here's my point. Porneia, with regards to divorce and regards to remarriage, is only used in the exception clause. And the other sexual sin type word that's used is adultery. So the porneia seems to have a particular meaning here, and there's a pattern of that use in that context. Second factor, it's used in a legal, ritual, covenantal, or specialized theology kind of context. And here it is used in a legal context. You'll notice in Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:9, in Mark 10, Luke 16, when Jesus talks about this, he gives a kind of an if-then kind of an approach to his language. It's very formulaic. It's different than the kind of conversational or debate kind of tone that happened before and after it. Here, this is a very if-then, which means it's a law that he's laying down. For example, you look at Matthew 5:31 and 32, Jesus references the Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 law when he says, "You have heard it was said by them of old time, whoever is going to divorce his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." He's referring to a law. And then he says, "But I say to you," and then Jesus gives an if-then. You divorce her, except to be for fornication, you make her commit adultery. If-then. So he's replacing one law with another. It's a very legal, formulaic type text. And so I think it fits that factor. Factor number 3, this is the only one that's orange on here. A technical definition is provided in the text. So the technical definition that I think is provided in the text, like we talked about earlier, is in the second half of Matthew 5:32. I think that is explaining the exception clause. Now, here's why it's orange and not blue. It's orange because not only could it be a technical definition of the word porneia, there's a lot of observations, as we talked about, that suggest that it's actually what it is, and that fits the text the best. It's the best reading of it based on the information that we have. But the reason why it's blue, not blue, it's orange, is because it doesn't say by porneia, I mean adulterous remarriage. It doesn't say by porneia. It doesn't tell you, Jesus doesn't tell you that's exactly precisely what it is. You have to infer that from those observations. And I think those observations kind of strongly imply that. So that's why I say maybe, leaning yes. So that's my point number 3 there. Okay, point number 4, factors for a technical term. The author appears to be using it in a special sense, and or the ordinary meaning doesn't fit the passage. So is Jesus using porneia there in a special sense? I think he is, and it is kind of a weird fit for the pattern. So you ask people who say, well, they'll say, the exception clause is referring to adultery there, they'll say. And you ask them, well, why did he just say adultery? Why did they say porneia? And they say, well, porneia technically fits more types of illicit sexual conduct than adultery does. Adultery has more in mind, maybe the man cheats on his wife with another woman, but, porneia, you could have all kinds of weird things that go on with, animals or whatever else. And so he's just using a broader term for that. Yeah, maybe. But, if Jesus had said, except to be for adultery, if he had used the word for adultery there, and then some guy had some weird thing with an animal, we would say, yeah, that qualifies. So that doesn't really seem to work. The word porneia is kind of a strange fit there, and it does seem to be a specialized sense because he does use porneia in the exception clause and uses adultery for the remarriage. So it does seem like something special is going on there, and that suggests maybe there's a technical meaning behind this word. Factor number 5 is it has a particular meaning in extra biblical literature, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. We already saw that with the Damascus document. We're going to look at that some more. And factor number 6 is that early Christian writings use the term in a kind of a technical way, and they do. We're going to look at that. So next, we're going to look at how strong is the extra biblical literature and early church writings. All right, first, extra biblical literature. We already looked at the Damascus document. Now let's look at something in the Talmud. Now here, let me just tell you the situation. There's a man and woman are married. The man goes overseas. She is told he died. She remarries a second guy. Then her first husband comes back. And the question is, what does she do? She's married to the first guy and married to the second guy. Now what do we do? So here's what the Talmud says. The Mishnah teaches that if she remarried as a result of an error, then when her first husband returns, she requires a bill of divorce from this one and from that one. Let me pause there. So the Talmud said she needed a bill of divorce from both the first husband and the second husband. Now that might seem odd to you. Why was that? Well, the reason she needed a divorce from the second husband is because that's an invalid marriage, as you'll see here in a moment. But why does she need a bill of divorce from the first husband? Well, Rabbi Hillel taught that Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, required divorce for adultery, which obviously he did not require divorce for adultery, but that's how Rabbi Hillel interpreted that. So if she remarries, she needs a divorce from the second one because that's a fake marriage, and she needs a divorce from the first one because she cheated on him. So that was the Rabbi Hillel view there. That's why it says she requires a bill of divorce from this one and that one. Let's continue with the Talmud. The Gemara asks, granted, from the first husband she requires a bill of divorce, as she is his actual wife. But from the second, why does she need a bill of divorce? Surely the relationship is merely licentious. And it goes on from there. But here's what I want to mention here. The Talmud refers to her marriage to the second husband as, it's invalid, it's a fake marriage, and it's licentious. That word licentious, I have it highlighted there, is the word zanut, and it means fornication. So the Talmud referred to a adulterous remarriage as fornication. So now you have to understand, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 19. The Pharisees, whose religious descendants later on referred to an invalid adulterous remarriage as fornication. So it seems like they thought that's what fornication meant in this kind of debate, this kind of context, when somebody gets into a marriage that's invalid because it's an adulterous remarriage. So here's that same Hebrew word. You can see it up in the upper left there. The same Hebrew word. You can see it up in the left there. And you can see it's translated all over the place in the Bible as, fornication or whoredom. You get the idea. So it's definitely the word for fornication there in Hebrew. This is the same Hebrew word used in the Damascus document referring to the two fornications of the man who marries a second woman. All right, that was the extra biblical evidence. Now we're going to look at the early church writing evidence for this idea that fornication was a term that meant adulterous remarriage. So what I have here are at least 4 early writers that called remarriage fornication: Clement, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Basil the Great. Here's what Clement of Alexandria wrote. This is in his book Stromata, and this is book 3 of Stromata. Quote, "But to put to shame and to discourage those inclined to contract a second marriage, the apostle appropriately uses strong language and says at once, quote, every other sin is external to the body, but he who commits fornication sins against his own body." All right, he also says this, quote, "For as covetousness is called fornication because it is opposed to contentment with what one possesses, and as idolatry is an abandonment of the one God to embrace many gods, so fornication is apostasy from single marriage to several." So there's the idea. Remarriage is called fornication, like Clement of Alexandria. Here's Irenaeus, quote, "Our Lord compassionating that erring Samaritan woman who did not remain with one husband, but committed fornication by contracting many marriages." He goes on from there. That's his Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 17. Irenaeus called remarriage fornication. Tertullian writes, quote, "If we look deeply into his meanings and interpret them, second marriage will have to be termed no other than a species of fornication. That's on Exhortation to Charity, chapter 9. Now, I do want to note something here. Now, Paul taught very clearly in the New Testament that widows and widowers can remarry after their spouse dies. Okay, now Tertullian and some other people in the early church thought that widows and widowers could not remarry or should not remarry. Okay, and here in this particular chapter here, he may be talking about widows and widowers, but nevertheless, Tertullian called those marriages fornication, which he thought were impermissible. That's kind of the point there. And here we have Basil the Great. He wrote, marriages contracted without the permission of those in authority are fornication. He also said, the woman who unwillingly marries a man deserted at the time by his wife and is afterwards repudiated because of the return of the former to him commits fornication, but involuntarily. She will therefore not be prohibited from marriage, but it is better if she remains as she is. So let me explain the situation here. His first wife left him. He remarried. His second wife does not know he was married before. The man's first wife comes back, and he goes back to her. The question is, what does his second wife do? And Basil the Great says, and I agree with him, by the way, that she can go ahead and remarry. The main point I want to focus on here is that Basil says that she committed fornication by her marriage to a man who had been previously married. So he calls that marriage fornication. That's the point here. So let's take a look at all of this together. We have some evidence. We have some evidence that the exception clause refers to an adulterous remarriage. We have the second half of Matthew 5:32. We have the Damascus Document. We have the Talmud. We have 4 early church writers. All of these suggest that porneia in the exception clause is referring to an adulterous remarriage. And so from that evidence, we're able to make 3 different kind of cases. The first one is kind of textual and contextual. Matthew 5:32 allows for this interpretation as a candidate, and it performs much better than adultery in that context. Jesus' argument mirrors that of the Damascus Document. So it appears that Jesus affirmed the Damascus Document view, and therefore Jesus' use of the word fornication also mirrors the Damascus Document. So the Damascus Document referred to a remarriage as fornication. So when Jesus uses the word fornication in the exception clause, he's also referring to a remarriage. And the last case we make here is that porneia is a technical term for invalid marriages, which we just reviewed. So let me know what you think. Subscribe, like, put in your comments. I'd love to hear your feedback, and I'll see you guys next time.